When you think of Victorian England, you picture elegance, corsets, candlelit streets, and strict moral values. But behind the gas lamps of London was a world no one wanted to talk about. Thousands of women, some barely surviving, some trapped by poverty, were pushed into filthy, dangerous brothels where disease spread fast and respectable society looked the other way. This isn't the romanticized version you've heard before. Tonight, we uncover the truth they tried to bury. The filthy reality of Victorian brothel women. London, 1885. The gas lamps along the Strand cast their sickly amber glow across the wet cobblestones, illuminating the faces of men who moved through the night with their coat collars turned up and their eyes cast downward. They were gentlemen, some of them, barristers, clergymen, members of Parliament. Men whose names appeared in the society pages, whose wives presided over Sunday lunches and charitable committees. And yet, here they were, slipping through unmarked doors in the narrow lanes behind the theaters, climbing creaking stairs, handing coins to women they would never acknowledge in daylight. The city had two faces in the Victorian era, and the gap between them was not merely moral. It was catastrophic, it was systematic, and for tens of thousands of women, it was a matter of life and death. The woman standing at the top of those stairs might have been 20 years old, or she might have been 14. She might have come from Birmingham or Belfast, from County Cork, or from the slums of Whitechapel, 2 streets away. She was wearing a dress that had been bought second-hand and already belonged to someone else before that. She had learned, in whatever time she had been in this business, to fix a particular expression on her face, neither cold enough to discourage nor warm enough to invite conversation she did not want to have. She had learned to be present and absent at the same time. And when the door to her room closed behind the man who had paid for her evening, she disappeared into a private interior world that Victorian society preferred, above almost anything else, not to think about. Before we go further into this story, and it is a story that deserves to be told fully, without flinching, if you are finding value in this kind of historical documentary, please consider subscribing to this channel. Every subscription helps keep these stories alive, helps fund the research that goes into bringing real people and real history back into the light. These were not statistics. These were human beings, and they deserve to be remembered. Now let us go back to the streets of Victorian Britain, and let us not look away. To understand what drove women into prostitution in 19th century Britain, you have to understand what the alternatives were. And the alternatives, for a woman born without property or connections in the 1840s, 1850s, or 1860s, were extraordinarily narrow. She could enter domestic service, working 14-hour days for a wage so small that a single illness could wipe it out entirely. She could take up needlework or piecework in the garment trades, sitting in badly lit rooms, stitching shirts for which she would be paid, at mid-century rates, perhaps 10p for 12 hours of work, barely enough to pay for her lodgings and bread. She could work in one of the new factories that were consuming the landscape of the Midlands and the North, standing on stone floors in the heat and noise and chemical fumes of a textile mill or a match factory, where phosphorus necrosis would slowly dissolve the bones of her jaw. Or she could starve. Victorian society was quite clear about the hierarchy of respectability available to women, and it organized that hierarchy almost entirely around sexual conduct. A woman who had not preserved her chastity, regardless of how that chastity had been lost, regardless of whether she had been assaulted, seduced under false promises of marriage, or simply desperate, was, in the language of the age, a fallen woman. And the fall, once made, was generally considered permanent. There was almost no mechanism by which a woman could recover her social standing once she had been marked as sexually compromised. Employers would not take her. Landlords would refuse her rooms. Churches, though theoretically committed to redemption, were in practice often deeply reluctant to extend that theology to women whose sin was sexual rather than pecuniary. The moral universe of Victorian Britain was arranged so that once a woman entered the world of prostitution, the walls around her closed very quickly indeed. This is not to say that every woman who entered the trade did so in a moment of absolute crisis. The historical record is complicated, and it deserves to be presented honestly. Some women made what they considered, in the circumstances, a rational economic calculation. Henry Mayhew, the great Victorian journalist and social investigator whose London Labour and the London Poor stands as one of the most extraordinary documents of the 19th century, interviewed hundreds of women in the street trades and the sex trade, and his transcripts are remarkable for the way they resist easy sentimentality. Some of the women he spoke to told him plainly that they had chosen their occupation in preference to the alternatives, that the wages were better, that the hours, though their nature was degrading, were in some technical sense shorter, that it was possible, in the better establishments, to eat regularly and sleep in a bed rather than on the floor of a shared room. One young woman from the East End told him, with the flat pragmatism of someone who has long since stopped pretending to illusions, that she had worked in a laundry for 3 years, and then, one winter, had simply not been able to make the rent, and that the choice, as she put it, had not really felt like much of a choice at all. But if we are being careful with the historical record, and we must be, we also have to acknowledge that the voices Mayhew and his contemporaries were able to capture represent only a fraction of the women involved, and probably not the most representative fraction. The women who spoke to journalists, or appeared before parliamentary committees, or told their stories to the reformers of the rescue societies were, by definition, women who had survived long enough and maintained sufficient coherence to have stories to tell in a public form. The majority of women in Victorian prostitution left almost no record at all. They appear, if they appear anywhere, as entries in police ledgers, parish burial records, workhouse admissions, and the terse case notes of charitable institutions. They were young, extraordinarily young by modern standards, and a great many of them died young, of venereal disease, of violence, of gin, of the accumulated physical and psychological toll of a life in which they were objects rather than subjects. The geography of Victorian prostitution was not uniform. It varied enormously by city, by class, by decade, and by the particular economic and social conditions of any given neighborhood. At the top of what contemporaries sometimes called, with mordant precision, the social scale of the profession, there were the kept women, the mistresses of wealthy men, lodged in comfortable houses in St. John's Wood or Mayfair, given allowances and clothing, and a degree of material security that put them far above the majority of working-class women in England. These were women who had typically been selected for their looks, their intelligence, and their ability to perform a certain kind of sophisticated companionship, to converse, to entertain, to project an air of cultivated ease that made them acceptable in the semi-public world of the expensive restaurant and the theater box. Their situation was precarious, entirely dependent on the continued interest of a man who had no legal obligation to them whatever, but it was, in material terms, a kind of comfort. The novelist and diarist George Gissing, who observed Victorian society with unflinching clarity, understood that for many women in this position, the arrangement was simultaneously a form of exploitation and a form of survival strategy, and he was honest enough to find the moral categories insufficient to contain the reality. Below that small and relatively visible elite, there was an enormous middle range of the trade, conducted through the system of establishments that Victorians variously called brothels, houses of accommodation, introducing houses, or, in the euphemistic vocabulary they favored for polite discourse, houses of ill fame, or disorderly houses. These establishments ranged very widely in character. In the better parts of London, around the Haymarket, which was for much of the Victorian period the most famous prostitution district in Europe, There were brothels of genuine material comfort, with parlors furnished in the style of upper-middle-class domesticity, with pianos and potted ferns and wallpaper of considerable quality, where the women were well-dressed and the clients were men of substance who paid accordingly. Visitors from the continent who wrote accounts of London's vice district in the 1850s and 1860s sometimes expressed genuine astonishment at the comparative luxury of the Haymarket establishments, at the confidence and relative freedom of movement of the women who worked there, at the absence of the open squalor they associated with comparable districts in Paris or Berlin. The Haymarket had a quality of theatrical display to it, a kind of brazen visibility that shocked moralists and fascinated observers in equal measure. But the Haymarket was emphatically not typical. For the great majority of women working in the Victorian sex trade, the conditions were far grimmer. The brothels of the East End, of the dock areas of Liverpool and Bristol, of the back streets of Birmingham and Manchester, were not furnished with pianos. They were rooms in tenement buildings, or cellar spaces beneath public houses, or makeshift establishments in courts and alleys where 10 or 15 women might be crammed into a single building under the nominal authority of a landlord or a madam who took the lion's share of their earnings. The women who worked in these places paid for their rooms, their food, and often their clothing through a system of debt that kept them in a state of more or less permanent economic bondage. If a woman's rent fell into arrears, if she had been ill, or if trade had been slow, or if she had made the mistake of turning away a client who had subsequently complained to the housekeeper, she could find herself locked into a spiral of debt from which there was no obvious exit. She owed money to the house. She had no other address. She had, in most cases, no family who could or would take her back. And so she continued.